welcome to The Presumption. I'm Sara Azari, joined by Jim Griffin and Matt. I will not say your last name.
You better not. You better not. Mondelier.
Mondelier. You guys, this has been really fun. You know, we've done a few episodes now, and people are so receptive and positive. We've gotten a lot of great feedback. And I'm just thrilled, Jim, to see that there's so many critical thinkers out there that are not just buying the tripe.
Yeah, no, this has been really, really good experience. I'm learning. I think a lot of our listeners are learning, and I was working out this morning at like 6:30, and
good for you.
And yeah, you know, you can tell, right? But someone came up to me at the health club and said they really love the podcast, and I've gotten a lot of compliments about that. So it's a thrill for us, and I'm excited to do it and continue to do it.
Yeah, me too. All right. So today, before we bring in a really great guest, Richard Gabriel, I want to talk to you, Jim, about the bane of our existence, one of them, which is jail calls. Like, hello. I mean, why are jail calls with our clients being monitored and recorded when there's no cause to do so? There's no search warrant. There's no crime afoot, none of that. And why are the privacy rights of their family members and friends being violated? I mean, their rights are gone down the toilet because they're incarcerated, but why is this happening? Just recently, but before I go into the actual specific issue that you're going to tell us about, there's a company, as you know, Jim, that the calls that are made by inmates from BOP facilities, those are the federal facilities. The BOP has its own internal sort of service that records and monitors phone calls. And there is actually an alert when you receive a call from a BOP facility that your call is going to be recorded and monitored, whether you're a lawyer or not. But then when you're dealing with these county jails and state prisons, a large majority of them, at least in my experience, are serviced by a company named Global Tel. And so you get the call from your family member or your client, and it says, this is Global Tel, and you have a call from an inmate at such and such facility. And it does not say, in fact, I can't remember ever hearing the notification that the call would be recorded or monitored. So that's number one, a problem. And number two, we are dealing with the ongoing problem of your client, Alex Murdaugh's jail calls, not only being recorded and monitored, but then disseminated to the public via or in response to FOIA requests. So recently, Matt, can you put up that headline that we just came across on TMZ that basically says,
it says
prison phone call with son Buster. I see prison. What does that even mean, for God's sake? Jim, can you, first of all, are you aware of this phone call? Were you there? Can you tell us about the context of this phone call?
Yeah, this phone call, Sarah, was made to Buster from Alex from the South Carolina Department of Corrections when Buster was at my home, had been at my home on Defusky Island. Defusky Island is the island off Hilton Head, South Carolina. There's no bridge to it. The only way you get to the island is by ferry. And the private club that I'm a member of, we have our own private ferry system. And Buster was leaving my house, getting on the ferry. He had been giving or preparing to give interviews for a documentary coming up in September. Mm-hmm. And Alex was reaching out to him. Buster had gotten on the ferry. There's a rule in my little bougie club that says you can't get on your cell phones when you're on the ferry unless you're in the very back of the boat. And in the very back of the boat, guess what? There's an engine back there. And, you know, Buster called me today about this TMZ story. And, you know, he said, you know, A, I wasn't supposed to be on the phone. B, I couldn't even hear what he said. And for TMZ to take this and I think we have the clip here, Matt, but for them to take this and reading way too much into it. And the headline is a clickbait headline. Like, you know, Buster is trying to distance himself from his dad. He's trying to move on. It's a chilly conversation. and nothing could be further from the truth. Matt, can you play that?
Wait, so before you play that, Jim, next time I have something to tell you and I don't want to hear you running your mouth in response to it, I'm going to call you when you're on the ferry. Just have to time it right.
I'm worried about his ferry membership. You got to swim. How's he supposed to get there?
Hey, Matt, you're not the only person worried about my bougie club membership.
Okay, so Matt, play the clip of the phone call, please.
A whole lot of time. I just boarded a ferry to get back to Hilton Head Island from Buster. Yeah, I know. I've been trying to call. I was supposed to call you while you were with Jim about this meeting. But anyway, how about text him and let him know I'm trying to call him? Okay. Did he talk to you about that? About the things about told him? No, I can't really understand you either.
Right.
All right. I'm gonna leave word with Jim, and he'll be in touch with you. Love you. All right. Okay. I'm proud of you. Thanks.
He says, I can't talk. I can't hear you. He says, I can't hear you.
Yeah, it's so, TMZ and other media outlets are just taking that and running with it. And I'll tell you, I'm not here to speak for Buster and his feelings about his dad. I do know that he gave an in-depth interview about those issues, and that will be played. I understand a press release went out about the documentary coming up in the fall, September, I believe. And so, I'm not here to speak for Buster, but what I'm here to speak for is these calls are being released to the media under this Freedom of Information Act request from the jail, where the inmates don't have a right to say don't record me, but and Buster and Alex family members, they're pretty much precluded from talking to him on the phone now, because this is not the first time. Early on when Alec was at the Alvin S. Glenn Detention Center, which is in Richland County, which is in Columbia, they got a Freedom of Information Act request that the detention center did, and they produced, I think, some 400 calls, and there were hours and hours of jail calls that were released to the public, and they were played on Netflix, and we actually, Sarah, filed a federal lawsuit over this, and we tried to enjoin the county from releasing these calls, and under the federal wiretapping statute. Right. We went all through that. There's a long order. The judge denied our motion for an injunction, basically on the ground of consent, that, by making the call, he consents, and by receiving the call, the receiver consents, the person he's talking to, that it will be recorded. And we tried to make the point in our brief that it's one thing to consent to allow for legitimate law enforcement recording. Right.
But this is for the public, for salacious headlines.
Yeah, but the consent was no one contemplated that these calls would be played on social media, on media outlets, and it's a huge invasion of privacy. And it's it's one thing to attack Alex Murdaugh and drag him, but to drag his family members. I mean, these are people that, he's gone. He's serving 2 LWOPs, and sometimes the only line of communication is by phone, given that he's in a remote facility somewhere. And they're essentially taking that away. People don't feel comfortable being recorded and being listened to, even though they're not saying anything criminal or anything wrong. It's just a privacy issue.
Yeah. So to your earlier point, Sarah, just hearing that call and reading that headline, icy phone call. And as you guys said, that could not be further from the tone. I mean, it literally ends with him saying, "Love you, pal." Like, "Love you, buddy." Like that is not an icy call. And if you don't take the time to hear the call, you just see that headline and you're just like, "Oh, here's more proof that this guy's icy," but it's like, no, if you listen to the call, you hear like a warm familial connection. It's clear in just that little snippet of audio.
It's also clear that he's not somewhere where he can freely talk. I mean, he straight up says, "I can't hear you."
And another thing, Sarah, Buster knows damn well that any telephone call that he has with his dad could very well be released to the
Right.
public, and it could be played on TMZ or what other outlet. And so, he's rightfully very guarded in his communications. And
Right.
and so, it's a problem. And it's the Murdaugh case, we've been dealing with it. And one of the, before we get to them releasing a call of my conversation.
Right. That's the even more outrageous story. Uh-huh.
Yeah. So as you know, Sarah, and we'll talk about, there are exceptions to the recording or monitoring a piece.
Correct.
And that is when a client is talking to his lawyer, and lawyers have to register their numbers with whatever service. And so then they're not supposed to, record.
I can tell you that doesn't
always happen.
Quite so recently, in my experience. I mean, recently, I'm talking about right before the pandemic. Should I tell the story, Jim?
Sure.
So I had a murder case here in LA County, multiple defendant. It really wasn't murder the way that you think, what you see on TV. It was essentially a honey oil, cannabis related honey oil business warehouse that set on fire. My client allegedly owned the warehouse, the business, and the man that was holding the pot of honey oil catches on flames. You see it on camera. And so it was a theory that they obviously failed at eventually, but they were trying to say that he knew so damn well that this was going to happen, and the business was so dangerous that this was murder. This was not manslaughter. So the DA was incredibly nasty. We'll call her Jane Doe, but in 2 decades of doing this work, I have never seen, usually we have a great civil, as you know, Jim, really great relationship with opposing counsel in our industry. She just was a whole other level nasty. And so we got to the prelim. My client was incarcerated, obviously, no bail. And he would call me regularly, almost every day. And we got to the preliminary hearing, the probable cause hearing, and she owed me some discovery. And I said, hey, Jane, we got the discovery. And she grabs a pile of paper and she literally shoves it at me in front of all the other lawyers and the judge. And I thought, wow, she must have a bad day, And I said, hey, Jane, you doing okay? You okay today? And she goes, well, I'm just a fat bitch. And I go, whoa. And I thought, oh, hot damn, like Jim says. The only place that she could have gotten that is the jail calls between me and my client. Now, I was not the one that called Jane a fat bitch. And, not that I've never said that in my life, but I did not say that about her. It was my client. And it was, she had no reason to listen, record, monitor, anything to communications with me. These are privileged communications. Like Jim said, they're protected. And God knows what else she had listened to, because we were going to prelim. She may have been trying to get my strategy as I was talking to my client about the case. Who knows? I mean, but that's what she extracted, that really, obviously, I would be hurt too. She was pissed off about it. By the way, my client has every right to call her whatever the hell he wants to call her. She's about to put him away, right? The fact that she didn't succeed at that is a different story, but that's at the time was the goal. And so she was so livid, and I was more livid because I felt completely violated. I felt my client was completely violated. I didn't have to raise the issue eventually in the case because we won on more substantive issues, and the client eventually got a manslaughter charge with probation in no time. So it was great. But my point is, this is a person who is law enforcement. She has a badge, she has power, and she's completely violating the rules. And my client's constitutional rights. And then fast forward a few weeks later, I think this is an interesting story for the listeners. She sees me in the arraignment courtroom, and I see her holding her phone, taking candid shots of me. And I'm like, whoa, what's happening?
Okay,
I know. I had to get the bailiff. Seriously, this person has some issues. I had to get the bailiff to go. I said, I'm so sorry, Sheriff. I said, she's deputy. She's taking, just like kindergarten. He goes over, he grabs her phone. Sure enough, my photos were in there, multiple photos. He makes her delete them. I call the supervisor. It's like a whole, and it's like, I don't know what this woman's deal was, but she violated.
Maybe you were looking a little pudgy that day, Sarah.
Maybe.
Sounds like she was trying to create her own alternative to TMZ.
Yeah.
Camera, she got the facts,
DA attacks defense lawyer now.
Oh, good gosh, that's awful. So, before we, I mentioned that we filed, a federal lawsuit. We actually got statistics, and I'm not going to get too deep in the weeds, but so recording at jails and prisons are permitted so that it's part of a security measure, and to be sure there's nothing untoward going on. There's no security risk. They're not trying to deal drugs from the prison, or they're not trying to, have a big breakout. And so that's under the federal wiretapping law, that's what's permitted. And so when we tried to drill down into that in our federal lawsuit, and it turns out that the calls recording in the local county jail in South Carolina, and I think it's pretty common everywhere, they're not used for security purposes. They're used for law enforcement investigative purposes. And I got some just rough, these are statistics that we got from the monitoring company, and this one was Altel, but from this period of time from January 2021 to March of 2022, they monitored 16,436 calls from inmates at that county jail. 15,000 were listened to by outside law enforcement agencies. 753 were listened to by other, we don't know what that was, and only 631 were listened to by monitored by jail officials. That's only 3.84% of all the calls for during that period of time for all the inmates were monitored by the people who work at the jail. For Alex Murdaugh, for the period of time he was there, he had 417 calls that were monitored. Not one of those calls was listened to by anybody at Alvin S. Glenn Detention Center. All 417 calls were listened to by outside law enforcement purposes, and part of their investigation. And then,
But then what gets swept into that, Jim, I think the problem, I can see how in a court, in a case in the courtroom, they can make a compelling argument why law enforcement needed to listen to these calls. Fine. Okay. I'm just giving them the benefit of the doubt, but to sweep in routine phone calls with family members where, it just like your client is serving 2 LWOPs. The case is not even open. The investigation is over. And these calls are still being recorded and monitored and then disseminated in response to FOIA requests. That I have a serious problem with. And I have even a more serious problem with the situation that you and I have been in, which is our privileged communications being monitored. We're not hiding witnesses, tampering with witnesses, selling drugs to our client, sending him contraband. If there's any reason to believe that that's what we're doing, which I've actually consulted with lawyers who've gotten in trouble. I think Mark Garrigus represented one. Lawyers are also could be crooks. And so there are lawyers who engage in criminal conduct with their clients. And so I get that. You go to court, you get a search warrant and you monitor, you basically show there's an exception to any kind of attorney-client privilege that those communications might have. But this is not that case, right? There's no evidence that you and I were doing anything wrong, and yet our communications were recorded.
Exactly. And
listened to.
Well, let me put another point on this. So, we're getting ready for Alex's murder trial, and all his calls are being, played in the press, played on Netflix. There's some calls being played on Netflix. And so one of the key witnesses in the case who was expected to testify was this guy, Curtis Eddie Smith, Cousin Eddie, as we all heard. So, Jim and Dick think, well, damn, let's just send a Freedom of Information Act request over to the Lexington County Jail. Let's get all of Cousin Eddie's telephone calls, since Alex are all being produced on public records request. And guess what? They wouldn't give them to us.
Why?
It's like, why?
Why?
And they withheld them on law and investigative, in purposes. There are exceptions under the Freedom of Information Act in South Carolina.
Yeah. So it was an open investigation at the time.
That allow the public agency to withhold it. They may, and one exception is privacy rights. Right. So the public agency may withhold it, but they don't have to. And so, once again, if it's
bullshit.
It is bullshit, and we're frustrated with it. But back to, as you can imagine, when the DA came up to you and said, "I'm just a fat bitch," and you realize where that came from, you can imagine how I felt when I listened to my calls of Alec during trial from the Colleton County jail. You got that, Matt? Let's play that.
From an inmate at a correctional facility.
Alex, I really got to go to bed. I need to call my wife.
No, I know that. I'm going to let you go. But the one thing I wanted to tell you, please don't think I'm being critical about that, because I'm not. I don't think you could have done a better job with him than you did today. But I do think that's something to think about, because that's one thing that seems to me to be a big deal, and that I don't know that the jury understands that right now.
No, I get it. I get it. Okay.
So, all right. And,
all right. I'll talk to you tomorrow.
All right, but remember what I said. Now, please don't take that as me being critical, because
I'm not.
I thought you did an excellent job with him. All right?
Good. All right. Talk to you tomorrow.
All right. I'll see you tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you for the compliment. Thank you for the compliments, Alex Murdaugh. But God bless you, Jim, because I draw the line on those late night phone calls. Some people can really abuse the cell phone privilege.
Hey, TMZ, that is an icy response from me. If you want to report icy, that was icy. I was tired, ready to go to bed. But can you imagine? I mean, he's talking about what happened in the courthouse during trial, and not only was that released to the public, but it was being recorded and monitored. Our telephone conversations. I mean, and to this day, we wonder, who was listening to our calls during trial, because we talked every night during trial. I mean, it is, it's very, very troubling.
It's outrageous.
And
I think
I don't have a solution, but something needs to be done, whether it's legislatively. Courts aren't helping right now, and so, I think this is a big, this is an issue that will come up in big cases across the country.
100%. I think just an idea came to me as I listened to Alec not letting you get off that goddamn call at like midnight or whatever it was.
I'm gonna let you go. But first, let me just say a bunch of things
by the way,
to prevent you from going.
But one thing is, when my wife heard that, she was glad that I thought of her right before.
Yeah, that's good. That's a perfect one.
Of course.
Yes.
So it's interesting that people don't realize. I talked about this with Jim on GMA. The different hats that we wear as defense lawyers versus prosecutors who basically seek justice for the victims. And the client management can be so difficult sometimes, more difficult than what you need to do in court, the managing the emotions, the family members, just all of the ancillary issues that are really very much at the heart of the case as well. So I think it would be really interesting also, Jim, if we did an episode, I don't know, maybe with a psychologist or somebody, or a bunch of defense attorneys about our experience with clients who blow up the phone, who, keeps flip-flopping and changing their mind about what they want to do. And just the management of clients, I think it's so interesting because we do it every day and we don't really think about it, but it's...
I've got a great guest, my own therapist. He could tell the world about how messed up I am having to deal with it day after day after day.
That's the collateral damage expert.
That's
All
right.
right.
That's right.
All right, you guys. Well, we'll be right back after a break. We're going to be joined by Richard Gabriel, who is a litigation and jury consultant. It's a name you probably know from the O.J. Simpson case and many other high-profile cases. So stay with us, and we'll be right back.
But before that break, let me just remind people to please subscribe to our show if you're not already doing that. We've got obviously so much great content for you guys to enjoy. It's available wherever you get your podcasts. We're also on YouTube, youtube.com/@thepresumption. And that's our social media handle on all those platforms, Twitter, Instagram, @thepresumption. And you can even send us an email at thepresumptionpod@gmail.com.
Oh, and can I add to that? Those are two separate things. On YouTube, you can subscribe there and comment. We love the ratings and the comments and the reviews and all of your feedback. But that's also separate from the podcast platforms that Matt just described, which are audio only. So we appreciate your follow and subscribe on both platforms, and the stars and the reviews.
Yes, please. And as Sarah said, we'll take a quick break, and then we'll be back with Richard Gabriel.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Presumption with Jim Griffin, me, and Matt. And today, as I said before the break, we're joined by a very special guest, Richard Gabriel. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you, Sarah. Good to be here.
So Richard is the president of Decision Analysis, which is a national trial consulting firm here in Los Angeles. He's participated in almost 2,000 civil and criminal trials across the country, including assisting trial counsel in the high-profile trials of O.J. Simpson, which is where I remember him from, Casey Anthony, Aaron Hernandez, Phil Spector, Enron Whitewater, and Kwame Kilpatrick. And 3 of the cases that he's worked on have actually made it to the Supreme Court and made it into SCOTUS decisions. He's authored several books, including Acquittal, which it sounds very interesting, and it's now on my reading list, Jim. I don't know if you've read it, but an insider reveals the stories and strategies behind today's most infamous verdicts about his high-profile trial work, which was actually optioned by Warner Brothers and CBS and developed into a network television drama. There's so much to say about Richard, but I'll end with this. He's also the founder of the Online Courtroom Project, which has assisted the courts, lawyers, and clients to improve justice system access, diversity, representation, and efficiency during the pandemic. So again, welcome, Richard. There's so much that you can, educate us on, and also our viewers. And without further ado, I want to sort of start with, we keep talking about jury consultants on high-profile cases, and the important job that you do for us lawyers. But I think a lot of people wonder what exactly you do, because it's much more than just helping with jury selection. So can you walk us through sort of the A to Z, or 101 of jury consulting, and at what point in a case would someone like Jim or me retain you?
Sure. Well, jury or trial consulting is often kind of a mystery to a lot of people. And, people are like, well, why wouldn't just lawyers be doing that? And the truth is that as lawyers, obviously you're steeped in the facts of a case. You're steeped in the law of a case. But a lot of times you are trained, and your focus for sometimes months, if not years of a case, are on those procedural elements and rules of evidence and things like that. But they're not actually how jurors decide cases. Mm-hmm. It's not about the psychology. So trial consultants are all about sort of understanding what's the psychology of jury decision-making, and how can we help the attorneys best present their cases to get the verdict they want. So we do a variety of things, including jury research, like focus groups and mock trials. We help prepare witnesses. We obviously are very involved in jury selection practices. We help design opening statements and stuff to tell stories and themes, and kind of try to basically help the jury, because while the rules of evidence have restrictions here, juries make decisions based on stories. And obviously the whole true crime genre is so fascinating to people because they're very compelling stories.
Yeah.
But sometimes in an actual trial, what ends up happening is the drama of a case kind of gets flattened out by the procedural rules. And so sometimes it's part of our job to help you as defense attorneys kind of bring that case alive to jurors. On the defense side, obviously, it's to help create reasonable doubt, to try and help jurors understand why the prosecution hasn't made their case. But obviously, if we're working sometimes for the prosecution, we're obviously trying to tell that story of why the defendant did what they did.
So how early would we retain you? I mean, what would you advise, for example, Kohberger's team, for example? Is now a good time to, I don't think he's going to go to trial this year, but at what point do we retain you?
Well, we always like to be retained as early as possible, because every once in a while, there's things that we bring to the table early on that help in developing discovery. One of the things that when I was working on Casey Anthony, Jose Baez called me even before Kaylee's body was found.
Wow.
And he, I was working pro bono on the case, but he was like, look, I am just getting killed in the media here. I'm getting, Nancy Grace is doing all these shows, and the pretrial publicity is just absolutely, creating so much bias in the populations. I'm not even sure how I get a fair trial. How do you help combat that, given that I've done a lot of work on high profile trials? And so there's things about developing things that I've seen, obviously, in these high profile trials about, in the Kohberger case, it is about how do you start questioning the investigation early on? How do you start developing that for the jurors? How do you make a change of venue motion? What are you things that you can start developing that can start helping even with the witnesses that you want to develop, or even in the investigation that you want to develop, to try and create questions about what the police actually did in their investigation that then inform essentially, your discussions with your experts as well.
Richard, that's so fascinating. And gosh, there's so many topics that we could spend a lot of time on today. One of the things that you mentioned early on is you do jury research. And I think a lot of our listeners, more likely to be selected to be on a jury panel or in a call to court to maybe they get selected. And what kind of information do you get on those folks? You say jury research, social media research. What do you do to research the jury panel?
Well, there's two types of jury research that we talk about. We talk about jury research typically as we're doing focus group and mock trials in the venue prior to the trial. So we are actually trying to gather people who might look and sound exactly like you'd get on your jury, right. Gathering them together in a room and presenting the case to them and going, what do you think? What bothers you? What questions do you have? What do you think is strong? What do you think is weak? What do you want to hear from the defense on a case like this? And that helps us to develop the story of the case and the themes. The second type of jury research is actually research on the actual jurors that are called by jury summons to the case. And those are usually social media research that we'll do. And hopefully we can develop a jury questionnaire that gives us a lot of information about jurors' background experiences and belief systems and attitudes, pretrial publicity exposure, all those things that help to then we do our social media research to help back that up to get a better understanding of.
Can you describe the relationship and even the necessity of doing a jury questionnaire and then voir dire? And, voir dire, obviously, I don't know, we're in LA, depends on the judge that you get. Often they limit us and how much we can ask and how long it needs to be. But regardless, not every case do we use questionnaires, but in those high profile cases where you do this, extensive research and you have jury questionnaires formulated, why both? I mean, what do you get out of each one?
Well, people are much more candid on a questionnaire than they are in open court. Mm-hmm. There's just that social appropriation sort of where people are like very conscious in court about what they say. Mm-hmm. So they're just more honest on a jury questionnaire. And the critical point for especially the defense in a case like this is that you want to get those answers on paper so that when they're questioned in court and then they're try to be rehabilitated, people try to back off their answers, you have their answers in writing so that you can then go back to the court and say, I'm asking for a cause challenge on this juror. And for those who don't know what a cause challenge is, in a trial, when you're doing jury selection, the attorneys have the ability to both make a challenge for cause, which asks the judge to excuse the juror, versus a peremptory challenge, which there are a limited number of. So you want to get as many cause challenges as possible. So having that questionnaire allows you to really say to the judge, they said this here, they said it in open court, they just have said that they've expressed a bias and can't get past that.
You know, Richard, jury questionnaires have been around for a long time, and I practice law in South Carolina in federal courts a lot, where I spend most of my time. And federal courts in South Carolina have developed a pretty extensive jury questionnaire that they send out every time. to, before the jurors are called in. And they return those, and we get those questionnaires well in advance. And it's a standard questionnaire, but what we used to get were handwritten answers on those questions. And those were the most informative as to how a potential juror would write. But now it's all electronic, and it's like looking at an electronic medical record. I mean, it's so sterile, you can't really glean much from, getting the juror's personality. Do they write, boldly? Do they write lightly? Do they, left-handed, right-handed? I mean, you could.
But then you'd get a handwriting expert on top of the jury consultant. I mean, like, how would you?
Well, we over time we became our own experts, and we could tell a lot from that. But
the key that's important, I think, is not only sending out the questionnaire is how do you ask really good questions? Because demographics are the poorest predictor of jury decision making, whether they're old or young or black or white or educated or not. It really doesn't tell you how a jury is going to make a decision in a case. What really is telling is their life experiences and their attitudes and beliefs. So if you can ask questions about the issues in the case, in Kohberger, it's the use of DNA, their experience with science, their cell phone usage, their how much they watch true crime. Those kinds of things tell you a lot. Getting to your point, Jim, which is really about you're trying to gauge where the juror is coming from, because no juror starts a case, especially a high-profile case, as a blank slate. It just doesn't happen. Everybody's preloaded with a bunch of stuff. So you want to find out what is going to be the filter through which they're interpreting the evidence. And that way, if you can get a sense of that, get a sense of their personality too, that really helps you to better understand how you're designing your jury panel ultimately.
Well, and in Murdaugh, Jim, in Jim's recent case, it was through the lens of guilt. I mean, I think with all of the podcasts and documentaries and things that were out there, that jury just came in with and that's another question I had for you, Richard, is that I've been told by jury consultants that even when you clarify misinformation for jurors and, disregard all the stuff that you've heard, blah, 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 listen to these facts. And even when they learn the facts that are in evidence, it's very difficult. This is like sort of a psychological phenomenon to undo the thought that was created around those non-facts. Is that true in your experience?
It's absolutely true. I mean, it's the courts have this assumption about the way the human mind works that absolutely does not exist.
Right.
There is no set aside place.
Right.
Courts, as you well know, the judges like to get up there and you've heard everything about the case and you thought they were guilty and stuff. Yeah, you can set that aside, can't you? That's absurd. Yeah. There's just no way they can do that. That being said, some jurors, like we found one of the problems we had in Casey Anthony was we did a focus group in that case in which all the jurors came in and went, oh, yeah, we think she's guilty. And of course that, there's been way too much publicity. Pretrial publicity is really interesting because it can also create a higher burden for the prosecution in the case, in which they go, okay, what's new? They become so used to all this stuff they've known and heard about things that a lot of times the actual jurors in the Casey Anthony case were like, yeah, what's new? And then all of a sudden the defense comes in there with all these new theories about, the kid drowning in the pool and the abuse by the father. And all of a sudden they're like, whoa, and it becomes more salient. And that becomes sort of gripping for the jury. So, it's to going to your question, really, there is no way they can forget it.
Yeah.
It's sort of helping them to understand. There's some people you're like, there's no way, you got to get them off the jury.
Yeah.
There's also people that you have to be able to understand. There are people who say, I did have some initial impressions based on these articles, but they're pretty self-aware and sometimes they can overcome some of their own biases.
Richard, and just share with you my experience in the Murdaugh case. We did focus groups. We were under a microscope. The media was following us around. I mean, there's hardly anything that we could do without it being reported. And the folks that we used when we went to focus group, they said, we don't want this focus groups to know that we're working for you.
Right.
And so they came up with, just this ruse that they were working for the media, different, and they were about to cover the story, and they wanted to know what these potential, the focus group, what they thought was interesting about the case, what they thought the strengths of the case were and the weaknesses of the case. And it was just to camouflage, what that they were actually our focus group, because if they knew they were our focus group, A, we thought we'd read it in the newspaper the next day, but B, we weren't sure we'd get a clean answer from them. But have you experienced that?
Yeah, we always, and whenever we do our jury research, we always want to make sure that they don't know. So sometimes we'll use camouflaging techniques. Sometimes we'll do things to really help throw them off. We're a university doing research, or people do this for all kinds of reasons. Don't worry about it. Just know that you're going to be our jurors here. We want to get your honest answer. So we do want to create that clean listening so they're not influenced.
So Richard, go ahead, Matt, go ahead.
Again, just kind of pulling back a little bit, kind of your average Joe type question here. Sure. And again, this may be a little blunt. I don't know if lawyers know this, but people hate jury duty. Every person that I know, that's the last thing that they want to do. If they get called onto a jury, it's just sighing. Should this be a concern for when you're trying to put a jury together? How do you find the balance of getting people who care, but I guess on the other end, if somebody cares too much, that's also no good. You don't want anybody in there who can drive the narrative of what this case is going to be like. I'm rambling, but your thoughts.
Well, no, it's nowadays, again, this was in my backyard. There used to be a time where people could use financial reasons as a legitimate reason to get off the jury. Like, I'm self-employed. If I'm serving on a 3-week jury trial, I'm just not going to be able to put food on the table. And the judges would actually consider that. Now they don't care. And so that you have a point, Matt, because that could piss off somebody who's like, God damn, I got to sit here and decide this person's fate. Meanwhile, I don't have rent to pay, it's a concern,
Yeah, it's tough. Nobody likes jury duty. It's interesting though, because no one likes it. I just was picking a jury yesterday. The juror was like, any reason you can't be a fair and impartial juror? The jury just goes, I just don't want to be here. The judge was like, I was summoned and I don't want to do it. I just don't want. And the judge is like, yeah, it's not a good reason. And extreme financial hardship is usually considered by judges. But the truth here is that what's interesting is most jurors actually who end up sitting on the jury really value the experience.
Yes, and they like the experience. They want to do it again. One of my first, I think it was my first or second felony trial that I was doing by myself as a young lawyer. Vincent Bugliosi walked into the courtroom as part of the jury. And he said, obviously, I couldn't believe, because I had just finished reading Helter Skelter. Matt, he was the DA in Los Angeles that prosecuted the Manson killers. Gotcha. And I thought, no way, Vincent Bugliosi's on my jury, But of course, both the prosecutor and I were like, okay, he's got to go, and he knew he was going to go. And he said something to the judge. Can't remember who it was downtown, but he said, God, I really want to serve on a jury. And I just, it was funny. He's like, I just won't get picked. And I've never served on a jury. Have you guys?
I've never served on a jury, but in my experience writing true crime stories, I have sat through, entire trials that are on YouTube. And in that sense, I feel like I've experienced jury duty. And to your earlier point, and this is another question that I have, what advice do you give to attorneys? Obviously, if you're talking to a star witness, everybody in the jury is leaning forward. But when you're listening to a cell phone tower data analyst who's just going through a spreadsheet line at a time, what should a lawyer be doing to keep a jury from falling asleep during these parts? Yeah.
Well, the truth is, trials are theatrical experiences. They actually are productions of a certain thing. So in terms of that being said, there are certain amount of technical stuff that you have to go through. The question is, it is really a combination of keeping them engaged both on an educational level as well as a theatrical level. So every testimony obviously isn't going to be very dramatic, but the truth is some of it's really necessary. So the question is setting it up so that jurors understand exactly what they're listening to and why it's important. And sometimes we don't do as good a job as I think we could in terms of really going, I'm now going to take you through this part of the testimony. Tell me why that's important. Tell me why cell tower pings at this time are important. How do you do that? The other thing that I think we don't do probably well enough is that we don't also create context for why that investigation is important.
Oh yeah, that happened in Murdaugh. I was like, what is going on? It was just going on and on. I can't remember. It was like the data expert and the prosecutor was not. It was putting me to sleep, Jim. I never told you this, but here I go. It was like, it was so dry, that information, that even I, as a lawyer, it would take me a day or so to figure out, okay, that's why he was asking those questions. And I think, it's terrible. But, listen, in all fairness, though, we have to think of so many things when we're up there that it's just so, it's easy to criticize and say, oh, well, maybe if he spoke louder, he would get the attention of the jury or whatever. But it's like, you're thinking of a million things. I do have a question, though. In the movies, speaking of media and all that stuff, jury consultants are sitting through the trial and watching what's going on like a hawk and advising lawyers what to do. Is that really, does a jury consultant have to sit through the whole trial and sort of continue with that consulting? Or at what point do you sort of seize the really hands-on sort of advice?
They don't have to. Look, there's a lot being made of, are you nonverbal specialist? And when a juror leans forward and crosses their arms and stuff, people in general, and jury consultants aren't necessarily that much more expert at it than are terrible at reading body language. We're all bad at it. Right. We think we know what something means. We don't. So, right. But here's the thing so to sit through an entire trial actually is not necessary. That being said, the problem is sometimes you as attorneys get so focused in terms of the procedural elements or the rules of evidence or things that you have to do to meet these things that sometimes it's difficult for you to pay attention to where a juror goes, whoa, I'm confused about this, or where I'm doing. So sometimes sitting during a trial like I did, I spent a lot of time sitting through the Spectre trial. And I was able at times to kind of go, okay, we're in big forensic case that we were doing, Linda Kenny Bodden,
right?
Spending a lot of time doing that work. Obviously, could be really dense stuff.
Yeah,
the blood spatter and GSR and all those types of things, and the DNA evidence. So helping someone sitting during the trial and going, you know what, I think they're lost on this point, or why doesn't this expert spend some time on talking about that? Sometimes that is useful.
Yeah, Richard and Sarah, I'm sure you've had this experience, but every trial we've ever done of any magnitude, we have a trial team, and it's limited to how many lawyers are actually participating with questioning and witnesses and introducing the evidence. But the support staff, their job during the trial is to take notes of jurors' reactions. And the first thing we do when we get out of court is we huddle up and we get that download of, we get the feedback from the support staff as to what jurors reacted to.
Yeah, but are you reading it right? That's what Richard's saying. Is like,
you don't know. You don't know. That's for sure.
You don't know. And I think that happened in your trial, Jim. I think there were some jurors that we thought, but they turn out differently. Anyway, in the Amber Heard Johnny Depp trial, which was obviously it was quasi-criminal, it was a civil trial. She just performed really poorly in that she was almost mansplaining to the jurors. She was looking at them like she's some sort of authority. Now, I personally always tell my witnesses, unless you're an expert and you're looking at the jury and you're like explaining something in your expertise, that you should really keep your eye contact with the attorney that's either asking you direct questions or cross-examining you. Is that something that you think is pretty much a solid, because I know that you have another important job, which is preparing witnesses for their testimony, right, Richard?
Yeah. So witness testimony is really important. It's sometimes not what we think it is. You're right. The sort of automatic turn to the jury and explain that looks very forced and is not very clear. Jurors expect the witness to answer questions to the questioner. Mm-hmm. So they want you to look at there. That being said, there are times where I think it is appropriate to include the jury in an answer. So it's not a constant thing, but it's really, I'm speaking to you, I'm answering your questions, but I'm also periodically including you in my answer. So
maybe where you need to emphasize a fact or something like that, or highlight, right? Yeah. Is that, yeah.
Yeah, but it's not, the truth is that, jurors are looking really for one thing. We spend a lot of time talking about likability and credibility. Mm-hmm. But actually, authenticity is really the thing that a juror really is looking for. So they really are kind of tracking on how absolutely candid, honest, straightforward is this witness being. Sometimes we spend almost too much time preparing witnesses to be very scripted, and we're going to cover all these points and stuff. And jurors feel like they're getting this canned testimony, as opposed to really something where it's like, I just want to tell you what I know.
Like an authentic account, I guess, right?
Yeah, I imagine if somebody is just constantly turning towards you to emphasize a point, it doesn't feel as sincere as somebody who's just really expressing a train of thought.
I mean, Matt, I can tell you, every law enforcement officer of any experience and prosecutorial expert, that's what all they do is they don't even look at the prosecutor. They just talk to the juror the whole time. And I hear you, Sarah, and I hear you, Richard, but I'm telling you, jurors lap it up in South Carolina when a professional witness is up there teaching them something that they don't know.
But that's the point that you just made, which is crucial, because I think, especially when you have a law enforcement witness or you have anybody sort of expert, jurors appreciate an expert who makes them the expert. The best things that, I think we can do with experts is to look for a great teacher, look for a great communicator, somebody who helps the jury truly understand what's going on there so that they themselves feel like they're the experts.
Right. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's the distinction. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, if we want to turn to Kohberger,
yes.
or I just have a big question because, we experienced it in Murdaugh. And I mean, you could not find anyone in the state of South Carolina that was competent to serve on the jury who had not heard of the Murdaugh case. And I think that's probably the situation they're going to find themselves in Idaho with the Kohberger case. I mean, they will have heard about it. And so when you go into that situation, Richard, we talked about it briefly earlier, but I mean, it's just not possible to pick a jury that has never heard of the case. And so, what are you focused on at the jury selection phase?
Well, doesn't the population demographics, don't those come into play? I mean, you were in a small county too, Jim. I don't know what the demographics are in Latah County, Idaho, but wouldn't that tell you, Richard, more or less what this jury is going to look like?
Yeah, it does. And those are kind of two separate questions. Latah is, I think, it's really tiny. I mean, it is 14,000 people or, 40,000, something very, very small in there. And of course, everybody's going to hear about the case and everybody knows about the case. So the problem we have, and this is where I've been trying to work with judges over the time, is they try their best to think of a trial as an ordinary trial. And it's not. It's just not. The truth is that we're supposed to get an impartial jury, and it's impossible in a case like this because partiality means you haven't, some of the definitions legally are indifferent. If you've heard a lot about the case, if you've seen a lot about the case, you can't be indifferent to it. You've formed conclusions about that. So the truth is, when I'm talking to defense lawyers in high-profile cases, it is to set up a jury selection plan where you are trying to help the judge understand as early as possible, this is not an ordinary case, and we either have to move it, which I don't think they're going to do in this case, and there's some reasons we can talk about why change of venue may not be a good idea in a case like this. Mm-hmm. But also, what are the special jury selection precautions that really need to take place in order to evaluate a juror's ability to understand what they've heard as news media and not actual evidence. Some people have the ability to do that, but it really takes a distinction there. There's some people who are just like, I've heard the evidence in the case, so that's what it is. So there's a lot of procedures that can need to take place, and you really have to start working with your judges early on to help them understand. Jury questionnaires have to be sent out. You might want to also do some survey work to say, look, these jurors know this much about the case. X percentage of the county already think he's guilty based on this. We need these questions in a questionnaire. We need special consideration about cause challenges from you, the judge. We need individual juror questioning as opposed to open court questioning on certain stuff. There's just a lot of things to think about.
So in Kohberger, look, the three, I think there are a lot of issues, but the three significant issues are the pretrial publicity, which is outrageous, extremely sympathetic victims, and emotionally impacted families and the community. This is a college town, and this is a off-campus housing, but it's university housing, and potential death penalty, obviously, right? So in light of those top three, what do you think would be the top three areas of questioning that you would want to flesh out to pick the right jury here, Richard?
Well,
sorry.
no, I know. It's a tough question because, I mean, I would actually reverse the order of that. Because when you're doing a death penalty case, death penalty is the issue. I mean, that's your first and foremost thing I need to ultimately, if they get to that penalty phase, I got to save this guy's life. Right. So you're literally trying to, the first question has to be about what is their view of the death penalty? And because the death penalty by itself, as you guys know from doing Witherspoon stuff, is the challenge is that, that pre-qualifies a predisposed jury towards guilt. When you death qualify a jury, they are predisposed. There's actual research which shows that death penalty qualified jurors are more likely to convict a defendant than anything else.
And Richard, to be qualified, they would have to say they could impose the death penalty. That qualifies them. And by saying that, then they have conservative leanings, I take it.
More people are much more conservative who have death penalty leanings, so they're qualified there. And it also, psychologically, it creates a presumption. When you ask somebody, can you impose the death penalty? Presumption is you're going to get there at some point.
You're going to have that question.
You know what, Richard, what Mark O'Mara shared with us recently on another episode, I mean, obviously he agrees with all of us that statistically a death penalty qualified jury tends to convict, and which sounds like you agree with that. But the other interesting thing he shared is that it becomes a balancing act for the trial attorney do you want to lose credibility by focusing on, the client not being guilty or being, working towards an acquittal, or knowing that you might get to the death penalty phase and you might not have any credibility left. So it's like this really crazy nuance of, what do you want to focus on more?
Right. And, do
you play a role in that to help formulate? Okay.
You do want to figure out sort of thematically where you're going and depending what your defenses are on this case. Because there's obviously a couple of tracks that you're going for. Some are actual defenses. So you're actually providing an affirmative defense, which is here are the leads that the prosecution didn't follow. Here are some likely suspects that they didn't do. Or, as we did in O.J., this is actually, a cover-up and a conspiracy that rush to judgment on that. That's obviously a much more aggressive approach than just reasonable doubt building and stuff. Right. So you kind of have to figure out which of those you're going to go because there's different jury that you're getting for each of those too. And so thematically, you're also trying to figure out not only death qualification stuff, but also, the pretrial publicity stuff is clearly going to be how do jurors, not only what have they seen and heard, but also what did they make? What conclusions did they draw from the media they have actually seen in the case? And then going to
I think it's much more restrictive because, trial's a fluid process, and often we go in with plan A, plan B, plan C, or at least plan A and plan B, and we just kind of are prepared to go whatever way we need to go. But it's almost like you said, when you have the death penalty case, you've got to sort of focus on either whether you want to put on an affirmative defense or you just want to poke holes in the prosecution's case, right? It's a little bit more restrictive in that way. Do you agree?
Yeah, I do. I mean, the problem
you don't sound like you agree.
Well, here's the challenge in this. Is, to be honest, there is no presumption of innocence. Right. There's obviously presumption of guilt. So the truth is, you're never just defending, and that's why most of the clients I've worked with, when they say, unless you have absolutely killed the prosecution's case through cross-examination, my belief is you always got to put on a defense, because jurors will always want to know what did happen. If it's not just, if you say it didn't happen the way the prosecution is saying, what did happen? You have to provide jurors, because the truth is, we have 4 college kids who are killed here.
Right.
In a horrible, horrible way.
It's not enough to poke holes. I mean, it's ironic because the burden is on the prosecution entirely, but like you said, we do have to, even though we technically don't, but we do. And on that note, Richard, I always think it's just so cheesy. We have to define the reasonable doubt, beyond a reasonable doubt, to a jury, and it's just we do the best we can, and it just it's never really a great line. And I'm wondering if you have a great line for that, because that presumption of innocence is at the heart of the burden of proof. So what is a great way to describe that to a jury?
So I think you should start earlier in jury selection and ask jurors about what is their process of questioning evidence, whether it's in their normal everyday lives. What is the process by which they accept something on its premise versus whether they really want to investigate it to figure out whether it makes sense, whether it doesn't. So I want it to be a juror issue, not just saying, here's a way of explaining reasonable doubt here. Because one of the things we're also doing in jury selection, and this actually goes for one of the issues that I would say, both for a death penalty case as well as just a reasonable doubt juror, is you want jurors to really dig in. You want them to not just be sort of obeying authority and just kind of, all right, prosecutor's a person of authority. They said they've got this evidence here. You don't want them just accepting stuff. You want skeptical to even cynical jurors on your case. So you want to find out their capacity versus, and sometimes you can find that out through the way through how they operate in their jobs, what kind of jobs they have. We're pretty good these days. I mean, we're a pretty cynical group of citizens now. We're pretty skeptical about anything about evidence here. So having that ability to really understand a juror's ability to just accept what is told them versus really kind of digging in and going, wait a minute, I don't know about that. That's where one of the characteristics I'm really looking for in jurors.
What part of the, sorry, Jim, real quick, just what part of the process is a potential juror having their social media profiles looked at and then being researched? Obviously we get the slip in the mail. We all show up to the courthouse. I'm assuming no one's looked into my stuff by that point, but if I'm in that second room and potentially going to be one of the 12 angry men, so to speak, do they know my stuff at that point? It's just kind of strange.
You realize Matt's on here. Matt's on here just researching for.
He's worried about that.
Yeah, I'm really trying to figure out how to get out of future jury duty.
Matt, when you get that summons, people are starting to research your social
already
media.
digging in. Oh my God.
Yeah.
So we know who you are, Matt. We're looking you up.
Yeah, before you get to the courthouse, we have given you an enema.
All right, Jim,
Yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say I want Jim to ask the question that I cut him off for my paranoid conspiracy question.
Richard, I was very intrigued what you said about Casey Anthony and the pretrial publicity, and it sort of conditioned the jury to think once they heard that evidence, well, they've already heard that. What else you got? And you got consulted on the front end about that. So if you were to get, it seems like that play may work in the Kohberger case. I mean, how do you do that in the public domain, especially in the light of, there's been this gag order for quite some time, and now it's loosened up a little bit. What role would you? How would you advise the lawyers to handle that? I think it's great that it happened to Casey Anthony, and I'd like to know how to do that.
Well, it's the truth is that when Jose came to me, he said, "What do I do? What kind of messages do I get out there?" And I said, "Jose, I'm sorry. You're going to have to ride this out for a while because there's nothing you're going to do that is not going to be turned against you. The whole media is just going to be negative on you. And so whatever you attempt to do is going to be turned on you. Just let it ride. It's going to be painful, but just let it ride for a while and it'll build up and people will get fatigued with it because there's this sort of overload, this cognitive load that becomes, okay, and because they look for something new. So at some point, the question is, at what point do you then start introducing? There are some cases where you don't want to ride it out. You want to wait all the way to trial. The defense has also the element of surprise, where they just nobody's heard anything about that. And so there's this newness that can have some salient. So sometimes you want to let it ride all the way into trial, have your investigators do this stuff, and obviously bring it in. But there are cases where it's like, no, we need to start dropping little pieces earlier on. We were very clear in O.J. We had to start early with that, just because the evidence was so huge in that case, and everybody was an investigator. So we wanted to start providing a counter narrative early on that. But
so one of the things, go ahead, Richard. Go ahead.
No. It's just a matter of sort of the timing and what is the thing that you're developing, and how important is that to get to the jury early, or how much do you want to wait? And that's a tough call.
So the timing is part of the strategy as well. Okay.
And I'll just throw this out, Richard. When in the Murdaugh case, we made that decision by filing motions in limine to point out the weakness and the fraudulent nature of some of the state's evidence. Now, we debated as to whether we should wait and pull it as a surprise at trial, or should we try to change the narrative going into trial? And that was a decision we made to try to change the narrative going into trial. I think we're successful in changing the narrative, but it also allowed the state to prepare for that, and then they changed their theory.
Through your filings, through your motion work, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things that people are telling me, reporters and such that are down there, been down there for several months, is that this is a very academic town, obviously because of the university, but that entire county, there's a lot of retired academic folks. There's employees of the university. There's obviously students. And as you know, Richard, Jim and I have been talking about the absence of forensic evidence, but there is some forensic evidence. It's a question of reliability. But there's also the lack of evidence, which is evidence. So obviously this is, it is to a large extent with the DNA and all that scientific kind of case. How do you think it would play out given the demographics?
So it's an interesting question.
Is it a good thing or a bad thing, I guess?
Well, you've got a smarter jury pool. I think it's crazy how educated this whole county is because of the universities that are around there. It's like, I think I looked up yesterday, 50% of the thing have master's degrees in the area. So it's a hugely educated population, which is good and bad. But one of the things I'd be looking for from a jury selection standpoint, I always want people who are overly analytical.
You do?
Yeah. Okay. Because I want them kind of really questioning stuff and really kind of, no. I don't just accept that this cell tower ping at this time was actually what are they actually doing to show that? I want jurors to kind of really dig into that. But, when we were working with, when I was working on the Spectre case, we developed a theme in that case was, is it story or is it science? In that case, we happened to have a very good forensic case on the defense side in that case. Yeah. But they had a really good story, which is all these women who had a gun pulled on them, and we had a
Right.
So one of the things I'm looking for in a case like that is, who are the people who just like stories? Because the prosecution is always going to be able to tell this story about, I mean, there's no real motive for Kohberger, but they've kind of created one by, this is a guy who's studied criminal forensics and sort of that serial killer thing that fits everywhere.
Right. I'm like, where did that come from? Like, we don't even know if he committed this crime, let alone all these other crimes, in the area. One thing that I think is really important that there's been a lot of sort of questions around is, we know that we should steer away from victim blaming and victim shaming, because that's a really bad look for the defense. But this is a case where this was a party house. The roommate, one of the surviving roommates, called the police 8 hours later. The house really was pretty clean. It was shocking that 4 people were slayed and there was really no biological material or one latent footprint, and kind of that's it. So it's I can see that the defense will want to be able to say, well, why did you wait 8 hours to call 911? What were you doing? Or, isn't it true that there was like a big party going on until 2 a.m. in this house, or whatever it is? How do you, in cases where you have to blame or shame or whatever you call it, victims, how can you do that without really looking bad or making your client look bad?
Well, you don't. I mean, the truth is, you don't have to blame them or shame them. The truth is that if you are, and it has to do with the approach that I think you take as attorneys in the case, which is, instead of you concluding these people are parties and they, and for some reason they alienated or created anger, that somebody was motivated to kill them and stuff, you don't have to do that. You can do this by just saying, look, the intent is to help the jury have the whole picture. So it's almost like you become the investigators, which is that as the defense, when we were looking at this, we had our folks, and when in the discovery process, we tried to figure out what happened here. And this one roommate wakes up at 4 o'clock in the morning, sees this guy dressed all in black he's never seen in his house before, gets scared, locks his door, and goes back to sleep and doesn't call the police for 8 hours. That really confused us. You just have to take jurors up to that point,
right,
and let them do the rest of the work there. You don't have to go, did he have something to do with it? Is he complicit with you? Because that becomes the shame and blame, and it looks like you're just trying to point fingers as opposed to do it.
That's a really good point. Richard, this is way too early to give Kohberger's trial team any advice, but generally, what's your thoughts about a criminal defendant testifying or not testifying? When should they? When should they not?
So tough, and I know you had to deal with that.
Right.
One of the toughest calls I think you had to make in that case.
Well, I think Richard and I and Mark Garrigus were on a panel on News Nation, and Richard and Mark were saying, if I remember correctly, no way. I was saying, no, he has to testify at some point. So it was like we were actually butting heads over the same issue.
Yeah, it's a really tough call. And we went back and forth with that on Casey Anthony, because we were like, the challenge with whether they testify or not, and it has to do with trial strategy, because, one of the things you want is, there's times where we're doing much more aggressive trying the prosecution case. And so you're doing affirmative defenses where you're doing that. And that's where I want my defendant to completely disappear from the case. I don't want them to be a main focal point. When the defendant testifies, it becomes about them. And unless there is some critical reason to have them on the stand, I don't slight you at all, Jim, because I think it was just one of those things where, what do you do with this cell phone video of him at the scene?
How do you get him out of there, right? I mean,
how do you get him out of there and stuff? So I think it's a very tough. So there's a question, number one, of whether you do it or not, and then also how long. And
right.
what, how long
the scope of it.
And because there's a timing issue on that as well. It's
So I don't know if you guys have any other questions, but I had sort of a grand finale question. It related to O.J.
No, I'm good. I just want to know if we made the right or wrong decision putting Alec on the stand. And anyway, go ahead.
I can't give you. I mean, I don't think there is a right call or a wrong call about that. I mean, it's a matter of, I don't know if
and ultimately, we all know it's the client's decision. So
absolutely,
it's the client's decision, and we had to, with O.J. and with Phil Spector, we had to browbeat them to not testify because sometimes they just want to do it. It's very tough.
You realize, Richard, that you've got one objective interviewer here, and that is me. You've got Jim trying to figure out if he made the right decision or not. Exactly right. He's got an appeal going and stuff. And then you've got Matt who's trying to get out of jury duty.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out what's on his social media history. That's what.
Right, exactly.
I will say I did at one point help produce Mark Garrigus' show, and when I did get called on a jury, they asked me if I had any experience, and I said I've worked with Mark Garrigus before, and the two lawyers looked at each other and they went, "Okay, you can go, sir." And I was like, "Thank you, Mark. All right."
I'm pretty sure you're done with jury duty after being on this. I
think so.
So, Richard, Judge Lance Ito, who was the judge in the O.J. case, excused jurors who had read the newspaper daily. That was a basis for him to excuse some jurors. How would that ruling impact jury selection today?
Couldn't do it.
You would have no jurors, right?
No jurors on the case.
Yeah.
I mean, the truth is, because there's virtually no newspapers these days. Right. It's all online.
But news sources,
The problem is judges, I believe, actually just have a very antiquated notion about how jurors actually get information. I think we need to do so much of a better job in these high-profile trials about how we talk to jurors about pretrial publicity. I think the judges need to be talking to the reporters and the networks and stuff about how they cover these trials, because I think sometimes everything becomes sensationalized. You guys know from a defense perspective that everything that's typically published is all pro-prosecution bent. And then it's, they throw an alleged word every now and then to somehow make a thing. But there's really no discussion on their part about here's some things that the defense may do that may question this. Here's the reasonable doubt element. There's none of that information that goes on. So I just think that, we just have to do a lot better job about identifying how does pretrial publicity actually affect how jurors can actually their idea of impartiality. How do they balance out? I mean, I'm writing an article right now about these potential Trump trials that are going to be coming up.
Oh, please share it with us.
Well, the truth is that, everybody has an experience of him. So, and everybody has an opinion, and whether it's a political opinion or whether it's just a personal opinion, there's just all this stuff out there. So the concept of the blank slate juror is a complete fallacy. And we have to sit there and kind of figure out not only what is it, there has to be a self-awareness. You have to evaluate the juror's own self-awareness, their ability to kind of do this. One of the Manafort jurors in the case was a very pro-Trump woman. She went into that case, didn't want him to be guilty, but said the evidence was overwhelming and convicted him. So the jurors can do it, but you have to really spend time talking to the jurors, not only about what they've heard and seen, but whether they've actually made conclusions and how fixed those conclusions are. And then talk to them about really the nature of the evidence that they're going to be hearing and their ability. There is kind of a miraculous thing that happens with 12 people too. It's really amazing. The more I spend time with jurors, the more diverse the group is, the more you have them come together, the more they can provide sometimes their own internal checks and balances. and can bring, a lot of our jurors in some of these high profile cases do think that the defendants are guilty. And when they go in the room, I mean, when I did the Casey Anthony case, we did our focus group ahead of time. Our focus group jurors said she's absolutely guilty.
Mm-hmm.
Jose didn't want to put on a defense. I walked them through the prosecution's case. And at the end, I said, how many people would actually convict? I raised a few questions. How many people would actually convict her of first-degree murder on this? And 3 hands went up. And I went, what? And I got, to do the focus group, because we didn't have money to pay for it, I got CBS to fund it so they could film it. And so they were sitting there going, and they were shocked. I was surprised too.
Yeah.
And I said, wait a minute, you came here thinking she's guilty. I just presented you almost entirely the prosecution's evidence. And they went, some of this doesn't actually make sense.
Add up, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wow.
And so that they are in a different role as jurors than they are as a general public. And there's something that's pretty amazing about that.
It's the dynamic as opposed to looking at each of them as separate pieces. It's the totality that's sort of, right? That could.
There is that. And there's also what happens I've noticed this in death penalty cases too. There are people who are pro-death penalty and they walk in the courtroom and they go, wait a minute, I got to sentence that guy there to death.
Mm-hmm.
That becomes very personal at that point, abstract at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that changes how people feel about it. So that's the thing that you're really trying to evaluate is more than anything, the longer I do this, the more it's about character. The more I think it's about the character of the juror and how they're going to interact with that evidence in the case.
So, Richard, it's been such an honor to have you on. You're just a wealth of information. I know that Jim got what he needs. Matt got what he needs. I didn't really need anything, but I learned a lot. I hope our viewers did too. Matt always reminds me to tell everybody to subscribe on all the platforms where you can get your podcast. Also, that is separate from YouTube. So please also go on YouTube, watch the episodes that interest you, give us a nice review, the stars, the comments, all that stuff. We actually look at everything, and we want to deliver a product that answers your questions on some of the hottest topics. So, Richard, this was sort of a early sneak peek at the Kohberger jury and trial issues, jury selection issues. But as you told us that sometimes you got to start really early. So I'm glad that we had this conversation, but I know that we're going to want you to join us when the trial begins, because we'll have a lot more pinpointed questions for you once we know more about the evidence. So I hope that you can come back and join us on the podcast.
And when my next jury summons comes in, I got you on speed dial, my man.
I'll tell you, man. Sure.
All right.
Take care.
Thank you so much. This is great. And until next time, Sarah.
Jim, we're gonna rest, right?
We rest.